Hello, welcome to Telesur. I'm Carla Gonzalez. This is Interviews from Quito, the program where we explore the big challenges facing this country and the region. In today's program, we take a look at the flow of migrants arriving to Ecuador from neighboring countries, whether it be Colombians fleeing violence and drug trafficking, to Peruvians seeking fair working conditions, to Venezuelans seeking a relief from the harsh situation worsened by the U.S. blockade. So what has been the response from the country on a social and political perspective? Is this massive flow of migrants sustainable for Ecuador? To discuss that, we have Camilo Molina, a political analyst. But first, let's take a look at this video.
After the U.S. sanctions applied on Venezuela, hundreds of thousands of people left the country trying to find jobs, medicine, or better opportunities abroad. Ecuador receives around 3,000 migrants every day, and the government has clearly taken a stand in support of them. But there are still reports of Venezuelans suffering discrimination, labor, and even sexual abuse. Ecuador, on the other hand, is living economic problems of its own, which don't even allow it to supply enough resources to its own citizens, making it more difficult for migrants. How does migration work? Which benefits and problems does it cause for any country? Follow our analysis.
So thank you, Camilo, for being with us. So tell us, is Ecuador really living a crisis due to the amount of migrants entering the country?
Thank you. And thank you, everybody at Telesur. I think it's not a crisis. I think it's a crisis of the global capitalism that is manifest in several aspects. Maybe us as a country that are still dependent, we require to go more to the structural conditions that are imposed. And these conditions are even more in depth in Ecuador because our economy doesn't only depend on our decisions, but also from the ones out from abroad. So in that context, we can say that there is a crisis that is perceived due to the hard conditions that are being maintained to keep the dollar as a currency.
And if we look at the numbers of how many migrants are entering the country, leaving the country, has it increased over time, or has it been throughout time the same amount of people that Ecuador is receiving? It's not like it's new. It's not a new process in the region.
Yeah, well, it's important. There's not only an economic crisis, but there is also a humanitarian crisis. Ecuador knows the meaning of migration because we've had migrants that leave our countries due to the crisis in 1999 in Ecuador. Almost 2 million left. Maybe we forgot a little bit about that. And now that we are receiving migrants, what's happening is that we're asking for the same things that used to happen on the other side. However, I think that there's two numbers. From 2010, apparently 250,000 Colombians came to Ecuador. Although we don't have like exact numbers, because we only have projections of numbers from the authorities. We don't have a census of migrants in the country. So if we check our last census, there's only 50,000 Colombians officially. However, we know through other registers that there's almost 250,000 that left the war and the bad Colombian governments that pushed them to migrate. Those numbers have been stable. So we've had the same amount of requests of refuge. So I think that the main amount of number was the Colombian. In the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a migration that comes from Venezuela. Some are just on their way, and we're not sure exactly of the numbers once again. But these numbers are very uncertain because many migrants come in, then leave. They don't register when they leave. And we don't know if they register when they come in. So there are apparently 7,000, then we spoke about 70,000. The last approximations are 2,000, 20,000. We don't know if they stay here or not. We know that the great part of migrants tend to move to other countries, and some go back to their country. So we're just really getting to know what's going on with the Venezuelan migration. But I think these are the two main groups here in Ecuador and reflect this internal movements. We also have to consider the Ecuadorians that have gone to other countries. And also at the south, with Peruvians, we've had some mobility. Many come to our country, to Loja and Zamora, the southern provinces.
And if you could analyze a bit, for example, how media portrays migrants from all of those countries that you were referring to, for example, from Colombia and from Venezuela. Why is the coverage of those migrants so different?
Well, the problem of the media is something that we should be concerned of, because there's a phobia against foreigners. Some years ago, there was an attempt to create a platform of mediums for the peace that had some prevention focus that was brought up by Colombia that tried to curve these tendencies. Unfortunately, this was not well received by the press. We're just finishing a study with many researchers about the coverage of migration, and it's basically negative. It's very sad because you only use one source and they don't go in depth in their investigation. And many times they just follow the political agenda. And at the end of the day, it's the migrants who have repercussions. Here in Ecuador, we had a very sad situation at the beginning of the year when the president said something about a migrant who killed his wife. And what he said is that we should generate brigades. And this had repercussion in international and national media. And there was the whole city, the small city of this man, followed this man and burned some things of his house. So we have to be very careful of what's happening.
That case that maybe some of our viewers were not very aware of what was going on. There was a woman that was killed by her partner, who was a Venezuelan, and then the president of Ecuador announced that we were going to make brigades. He wanted people to make brigades to protect Ecuadorians from Venezuelans.
Sí, en realidad ese fue el pronunciamiento, y fue tan ambiguo el pronunciamiento sobre todo este concepto de brigadas.
This concept of brigade was ambiguous, and it was replicated in the media. And in the afternoon, some popular brigades were created, and they went against the Venezuelans. And you can see that from a political speech that was not clarified. It was clarified after the harm was made. And of course, the people just read it, and they read into whatever they think. And the presence of migrants is perceived in a negative way. It's not only against Venezuelans. We have to reflect on what we're doing with migration in general. We have to see, like, for example, what happens in Argentina with the Bolivian migration, or with Brazil with the Venezuelan migration too. So we're generating a framework that does not foster free mobilization, and of course not at the least bit the Latin American integration. So we have to review these issues. We can check the data that less than 4% of the people in jails are foreigners. But of course, whenever there is an isolated event of a foreigner, it immediately has a repercussion in the popular conscience. So we have to rethink.
And many
this
of the
topic.
migrants that are arriving to Ecuador, they're suffering discrimination. How can we analyze not just verbal communication, maybe discrimination at work? They can't find jobs, they can't access healthcare, for example. How would you analyze this process, this phenomenon that is occurring?
Well, in general, migration has like a pattern, a structure, that the migrants that arrive to a country tend to have low-paying jobs. This breaks a myth that migrants come to steal the Ecuadorian jobs. I think we have to rethink this. Far beyond taking away jobs, they just fill in jobs that are not wanted by the nationals. In services, in agriculture. In our country, we've seen it in Ecuador, there have been migrants who start working, who are incorporated in the workforce, where most of them come to as services. They don't have Social Security. They're basically women who take care of children and adults, and a man force that is dedicated, that you can basically not even see them, like informal minery or the fields or sales, that don't have a system, a work system. They're just paid by days or by hours. That's a way of surviving. Flaxo and ACNUR have shown that they're very poor, that they have a very basic way of life. They speak of, we're thinking of $5 a day per family. That's like 120 per month. And this complicates their lives a lot. And there is also a political speech that says we have to control migrants, and this leads to have a rejection to contract or hire migrant people.
And what would you say to those who criticize the arrival of migrants, for example, in the case of Ecuador, where we see reports of the health system being very much broken? There's a lot of, there's a lack of access to healthcare for Ecuadorians themselves. And also in the job market, there's less and less jobs available for Ecuadorians in general.
Well, in general, the situations are much more vulnerable for migrants. And here we have to think what's happening with the Venezuelan migration, because there's a legal differentiation even to the access of health. Like little over a year ago, it is required for Venezuelans to have a private health insurance to be able to have some type of a visa to come to Ecuador. This complicates everything because it was brought about some demands, some lawsuits of how much it would cost for the migrants to come to go past our country. The same thing happened with refugees some years ago. And because we're thinking of how much it costs to give them health services. In some instances, we have thought that it has been thought that the Venezuelans should pay for their own services, but this is discrimination. And they're trying to avoid going to health services because they don't want to be deported. And this is part of the mass media perception that is given to the migrants. because them themselves can feel as if they're intrusive. I have worked with several women who say that have difficulties going through with their pregnancy. Some people don't go 2 or 3 years to medical checkup, even if they do have some health problems. And the local authorities don't inform the people about these things. So there's local governments and national governments, and what happens with the local people? But it is very hard to have social security and health services in general. And if we add to this the type of jobs that they have, which are difficult, of course, we are giving them a very basic, below basic way of life.
You would say that they don't pose a threat to locals and in the issue of health and education and jobs. They actually give an insight into what's wrong about the system to actually be able to change it.
Sí, además,
yes.
Bueno, yo creo que nosotros
I think that we can start thinking from the point of view of rights. And we can't say that the rights are for some people and are not for some others. For example, there's a right of mobilization that is in our Constitution, and which is very progressive, in fact. There's a law that's in place since a couple of years ago that keeps this focus with the right of mobilization. And there are international charters that also say so. But what we have to recover is that under some policies of nationalism, we should restrict the income of migrants. Some of them are just on their way, but we also have to take care of them as human beings. They are not a threat. They, on the contrary, they can be an opportunity. Because as we said, they take the place of people that national people don't want them. But there are many migrants, there are highly professional people that can help develop many fields, and we have information that say that migration generates innovation and growth. If we don't want to see this, and we would just want to be closed in, of course, migration will be a problem.
So, and you were saying it at the beginning of the interview, it seems like Ecuador forgot that it did have an economic crisis in 1999, 2000, the years, almost 20 years now. And we also had millions of people fleeing from the country, and they were living in very harsh conditions in Europe, in the United States as well.
I think that we have to talk about a fundamental element that we've got a wild capitalism that doesn't take into account the life of people. What happens in the crisis? During the crisis, there's a lot of difference between those who do have some money and those who doesn't. And this creates a conflict among the lower levels. And we just forget where the causes came from. We had a crisis in 1999 that had clear names. There was a corrupt politicians, a banking system that just went broke. And this that happened is still in the memory, but we do forget. We tend to forget. And we think that that person who's selling in the street is the culprit. And we forget that it's the authorities. We have to recover this macro image. And we have to understand that a migration is not a threat, and on the contrary, it's an opportunity. I think that we're in a dark situation in the region where the leaderships that have arose have used nationalism as a quick tool to make us forget what are the real causes and just put us in tension between in these situations.
Question before we go. What can then migrants do about it? Are they hopeless? They can't do anything. They are in the hands of governments and their nationalist discourses?
I think that not only what can they do, on the contrary, what can we learn from them? We have to remember resilience, which means that there is a catastrophe or there's a crisis, there's a capacity to rebuild yourself. I think that we have to learn this from the migrants, that whoever leaves the country, we've learned from families, and they have new capacities. I think they can build their own paths, but we've seen that there's a great number of people that get together and they construct proactive associations and businesses, and I think that what we have to do is allow them to grow, where we can learn from what they have and let them develop what they can give and get the politics out of this topic. I think we should go back to the Venezuelan migration, because we can't explain our crisis because of the Venezuelan migrants. It's true that we do have some repercussions with migration, but as neighboring countries, we also had these problems. And let's take the example of how Venezuela took in the Colombian migrants. And they also took in Ecuadorian migrants, and they created a state that's multicultural, with all of the difficulties it comes with. So that's the path. Nobody's going to stop migration. We are people that migrate from one place to another, and the only thing that we ask is not to close the door, just as the other doors were opened when we left.
Thank you very much, Camilo. We are unfortunately running out of time, but thank you very much for explaining to us and for opening up this topic to debate.
Okay, well, thank you.
So we've been talking to Camilo Molina, political analyst, on the flow of migrants entering Ecuador and the conditions they and the locals live due to this. Thank you for watching. This is Interviews from Quito. I'm Carla Gonzalez. Until next time.